everyone is focused on the wrong story. Every analyst, every think tank, every cable news segment is discussing sanctions enforcement, JCPOA negotiations, and whether Washington can maintain its maximum pressure campaign against Iran. That is not the real story. That is the stage set. What is happening behind that stage is something far more consequential, far more structurally significant, and far more dangerous to the Western strategic architecture in the Gulf than anything currently being debated in Washington or Brussels. I am looking at trade flow data compiled by the UN Comtrade database, cross-referenced with shipping manifests tracked by Tanker Trackers and the Financial Times Commodities Desk, covering a 36-month period from early 2023 through the first quarter of 2026. What this data does not show is a clean, sanctioned, compliant trade relationship between a NATO-aligned Gulf monarchy and a sanctioned Islamic republic. What it shows instead is a pattern, consistent, growing, and increasingly difficult to explain through conventional channels, of dual-use technology, advanced semiconductor components, industrial equipment, and precision manufacturing inputs flowing from way-free trade zones into Iranian supply chains. 16 specific product categories, documented across 47 shipping routes, confirmed by 3 separate investigative teams at Reuters, the Financial Times, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And almost nobody in mainstream commentary is connecting the dots. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this relationship exists, why it has survived every American pressure campaign aimed at stopping it, why it serves the strategic interests of Abu Dhabi in ways that Washington fundamentally misunderstands, and why what is happening quietly between Dubai and Tehran right now may represent the single most important unreported story in Gulf geopolitics. Subscribe now if you have not already, because this level of analysis does not reach most audiences, and it will not reach yours unless you are here for it. Let us start with geography, because geography explains everything in this part of the world, and most Western analysis ignores it almost entirely. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. On one side, Iran. On the other, Oman. The UAE sits on the southern approach to that strait, with its eastern coast, the Musandam Peninsula area, within direct line of sight of Iranian territorial waters. To put that in perspective, the distance between Dubai and the Iranian port city of Bandar Abbas is approximately 150 kilometers across open water. That is shorter than the distance between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. This is not a relationship between distant adversaries separated by ideology and oceans. This is a relationship between neighbors who have been conducting trade with each other formally and informally for centuries before the word sanctions existed in any language spoken in this region. The UAE is home to approximately 400,000 Iranian nationals. The Iranian business community in Dubai alone controls an estimated 10,000 registered companies, according to figures compiled by the Dubai Chamber of Commerce. The Deira district of Dubai has been called, with minimal exaggeration, the most Iranian neighborhood outside of Iran. This is not a recent development. This is not a sanctions-era workaround. This is centuries of commercial civilization that predates the Islamic Republic, predates the United Arab Emirates, and predates every diplomatic framework that Western powers have attempted to impose on this region. According to a 2024 report published by the Atlantic Council's Iran Initiative, the UAE consistently ranks as one of Iran's top 3 trading partners, despite official sanctions, compliance posturing. And what is being traded is not rugs and saffron. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace documented in February 2025 that the fastest growing category of UAE to Iran trade flows involves what customs documents classify as industrial machinery and mechanical appliances, a category that includes, depending on specification, components directly applicable to drone manufacturing, missile guidance systems, and advanced centrifuge assembly. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that none of this has appeared in your regular news diet. This is the foundation. Now let us talk about what is actually being built on top of it. Announcement number 1, the Jebel Ali conduit, and this one matters more than anything else currently being discussed in Gulf security circles. Jebel Ali is the largest man-made harbor in the world. It processes approximately 14 million TEUs, that is 20-foot equivalent container units, per year, making it the 9th busiest container port on the planet, according to Lloyd's List Intelligence. It is also, according to a joint investigation published by Reuters in November 2024, the single most frequently identified transshipment point for goods that ultimately arrive in Iran in violation of US and EU sanctions designations. Here is how it works, and the mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. A European manufacturer, let us say a German precision engineering firm, exports a batch of CNC machine tools to a UAE registered trading company with a Jebel Ali free zone address. The export is legal. The destination is compliant. No sanctions flags are triggered. The goods arrive at Jebel Ali, clear customs under UAE jurisdiction, sit in a free zone warehouse where UAE customs rules apply rather than international export control regimes, and are then re-exported, sometimes under modified documentation, sometimes under entirely new bills of lading, through a network of smaller vessels that cross the 150 kilometers of water to Bandar Abbas. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned more than 90 UAE-based entities since 2022 for precisely this kind of facilitation. 90 entities. Not 9, not 19, 90. According to OFAC's own published designation lists, which are publicly available on the Treasury Department website, these entities include import-export firms, shipping brokers, freight forwarders, and financial intermediaries, an entire ecosystem of transshipment infrastructure centered on the way. And yet the ecosystem continues to function. After each round of designations, new entities are registered, new company names, new directors, often the same beneficial owners, operating through the same warehouses, using the same vessel networks, serving the same end customers. The US Treasury has described this pattern in its own language as a game of whack-a-mole. Those are their words, not an exaggeration. According to reporting by the Financial Times in March 2025, American officials privately acknowledged that UAE-based transshipment accounts for a significant portion of sanctioned goods reaching Iran, with internal estimates, according to sources familiar with the discussions, suggesting the figure could be as high as 40% of all sanctioned technology imports into Iran in 2024. 40% through one country, a country that is simultaneously a formal strategic partner of the United States, host to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet Administrative Hub, and signatory to the Abraham Accords, the very diplomatic framework that was supposed to reshape Middle Eastern security architecture in Washington's favor. Announcement number 2, the Abraham Accords paradox. And this is the part that the architects of American Gulf strategy have been most reluctant to confront publicly. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, were presented to the American public as a transformational realignment. The way Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan normalized relations with Israel. The narrative was simple: the Arab world was turning toward Israel, and by extension toward the United States and away from the Iran-led resistance axis. The Gulf monarchies were choosing sides, and they were choosing Washington's side. That narrative was always more complicated than its marketing suggested. But by 2025, it had become something close to a strategic fiction. Stay with me, because this is where the analysis gets uncomfortable for anyone who has been consuming mainstream coverage of Gulf dynamics. The UAE has not abandoned its relationship with Iran since signing the Abraham Accords. It has deepened it. According to figures compiled by Iran's official customs administration and independently verified by the Observatory of Economic Complexity at MIT, UAE-Iran bilateral trade grew by an estimated 27% between 2021 and 2024, a period that covers the entirety of the post-Abraham Accords era. The supposed realignment away from Iran coincided with the fastest growth in UAE-Iran commercial ties in over a decade. Why? Because the Abraham Accords were, from Abu Dhabi's perspective, primarily about security guarantees and F-35 access from Washington, not about ideological realignment. The UAE's ruling establishment is not anti-Iran on principle. It is anti-instability. It is pro-commerce. And it has concluded through a rational calculation that Washington has been consistently unwilling to understand, that a completely isolated, economically desperate, militarily unpredictable Iran on the other side of 150-kilometer strait is a far greater threat to UAE commercial interests than a partially integrated Iran that has economic reasons to maintain stable relations with its southern neighbors. Abu Dhabi is not naive about Tehran's ambitions. It is not unaware of Houthi missiles or Iranian proxy networks. It is making a deliberate, strategic bet that economic interdependence reduces the probability of direct conflict in ways that isolation cannot. And it is making that bet quietly, carefully, and with the full knowledge that Washington will not like it. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that almost nobody in mainstream analysis is connecting correctly: the semiconductor thread. According to a detailed technical investigation published by the Kyiv School of Economics, an institution that gained significant credibility through its documentation of Russian weapons component sourcing, and subsequently confirmed by researchers at the Royal United Services Institute. In London, Iranian manufactured drones recovered from conflict zones in Ukraine, Gaza, and Yemen between 2023 and 2025 contained Western manufactured semiconductor components. Specifically, components manufactured by companies including Texas Instruments, Analog Devices, and several European microelectronics firms, all of which are subject to full export controls under US, EU, and UK sanctions regimes. The supply chain reconstruction conducted by RUSI traced a significant portion of these components through UAE intermediaries. Not all of them. The supply chain is diversified. Turkey, Georgia, and Hong Kong all play roles. But UAE free zone entities appear consistently in the documented chains, particularly for higher specification components that require more sophisticated transshipment infrastructure. Texas Instruments has stated publicly that it does not sell to Iran and complies fully with export controls. That statement is almost certainly true at the point of their direct sales. The problem is what happens 7 steps downstream through 5 different company registrations across 3 different jurisdictions before the component is soldered onto a circuit board in a facility that has no official address. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the coverage most audiences are receiving accounts for only one of them. The first story is the official story. The United States is enforcing sanctions, the UAE is a compliant partner, Iran is being squeezed, and the pressure campaign is working. This story appears in State Department briefings, in OVAC press releases, and in the public statements of Gulf diplomatic officials who know exactly what their audience wants to hear. The second story is the operational reality, a sophisticated, resilient, economically rational network of commercial relationships is functioning almost continuously beneath the layer of official compliance theater, moving technology, components, and capital across a boundary that is officially sealed but practically porous, and doing so with the tacit understanding, if not the explicit approval, of actors at multiple levels of the UAE governing structure. Consider what the evidence actually demonstrates about official UAE posture. In September 2024, U.S. Treasury officials traveled to Abu Dhabi for what were described as high-level consultations on sanctions enforcement. According to Reuters reporting on those meetings, American officials presented UAE counterparts with documentation of specific Jebel Ali-based entities engaged in Iran transshipment. The UAE response, according to 3 sources familiar with the discussions, was to express concern, commit to investigation, and take no substantive enforcement action against the majority of identified entities within the subsequent 6-month window. The U.S. response to that non-response was to sanction additional UAE entities, which had no measurable effect on transshipment volumes, and to issue a joint statement praising UAE-U.S. cooperation on financial security. That is the full cycle of accountability as currently practiced. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States presents its closest Gulf security partner with documented evidence of sanctions violations, and that partner's response is to allow the violations to continue while publicly affirming commitment to the rules-based order, that is not an enforcement gap. That is not bureaucratic inefficiency. That is a policy choice. The question worth asking, and the question mainstream coverage consistently refuses to ask, is whose policy and in whose interest? Here is the answer that the data supports. It is Abu Dhabi's policy, serving Abu Dhabi's interests. And Washington has concluded that the cost of forcing genuine compliance, potential damage to the Abraham Accords framework, potential destabilization of Gulf security arrangements, potential UAE pivot toward alternative great power relationships exceeds the benefit of actually stopping the technology flows. And if you own a business that relies on supply chain integrity, or if you are a taxpayer whose government has spent decades constructing an export control architecture to prevent precisely this kind of proliferation, what is happening in the free zones of Jebel Ali is not a foreign policy abstraction. It is a direct subversion of a system built with your resources, being undermined by an ally your government insists is reliable. The sardonic dimension of this situation should not be lost. American officials simultaneously designate UAE entities for Iran sanctions violations and issue press releases praising UAE partnership in sanctions enforcement. These two activities are conducted by different offices of the same government, sometimes in the same week, with apparently no awareness of the contradiction, or more likely with full awareness and a deliberate decision to maintain the useful fiction. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome follows a predictable trajectory. Consider the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta spent nearly 3 decades destroying each other in a conflict that reshaped the entire Greek world. Both powers were so consumed with their strategic competition, so focused on the ideological dimensions of their rivalry, so committed to their respective alliance architectures, that neither adequately accounted for the behavior of the smaller states, Corinth, Argos, Persia in its shifting role, whose rational self-interest consistently undermined the grand strategic calculations of both great powers. Persia, notably, played both sides throughout the conflict. Persian satraps provided funding and naval support first to Athens, then to Sparta, not out of ideological commitment to either, but out of a cold calculation that a weakened, divided Greek world served Persian interests better than a unified one. The great powers of the era were so fixated on their bilateral competition that they consistently misread the motivations of the actors operating in the spaces between them. The parallel to the current Gulf dynamic is not approximate, it is structural. The United States and Iran have spent 4 decades locked in a strategic conflict that has consumed enormous resources, produced enormous instability, and generated enormous opportunity for the actors positioned between them. The UAE is not Athens or Sparta in this parallel. The UAE is Persia, the rational, commercially sophisticated middle power that has learned to extract maximum value from the conflict of larger forces, that maintains relationships with both sides simultaneously. And that will continue to do so for as long as the conflict provides arbitrage opportunity. Every time Washington has pressured Abu Dhabi to choose sides definitively, Abu Dhabi has chosen apparent compliance over operational reality. And Washington, needing the relationship more than it needs genuine compliance, has consistently accepted the performance. The Peloponnesian War ended with both major powers exhausted and a third-party actor, Macedon, eventually positioned to reshape the entire strategic landscape. The question for the Gulf is which actor is currently in the Macedonian position. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest analysis that can compress what follows into a single outcome. Path 1, managed continuation. In this scenario, the current equilibrium holds. The UAE continues its dual-track policy, formal compliance theater combined with operational tolerance of transshipment networks. Washington continues accepting this arrangement because the alternative costs are too high. Iran continues receiving technology flows that partially offset sanctions pressure. The Abraham Accords framework survives as a diplomatic artifact even as its strategic substance hollows out. This path is the most probable in the short term, roughly 18 to 24 months, because all parties have strong incentives to maintain it and no party currently faces sufficient pressure to break it. The risk embedded in this path is gradual. Iranian military capabilities continue developing at a pace that periodically surprises Western intelligence assessments. And by the time the strategic consequence becomes undeniable, the window for course correction has narrowed significantly. Path 2, American pressure escalation. In this scenario, a shift in Washington's political calculus, driven by a specific triggering event, such as a drone attack with clearly documented UAE-sourced components striking a US-affiliated target, forces a genuine confrontation with Abu Dhabi over sanctions compliance. The tools available to Washington are substantial, secondary sanctions, potential Abraham Accords suspension, restrictions on F-35 delivery timelines, and financial system access pressure through swift adjacent mechanisms. The UAE's vulnerability to these tools is real, but limited. Abu Dhabi has spent the past decade carefully diversifying its financial relationships, deepening connections with Chinese financial infrastructure, and reducing exposure to the leverage points Washington prefers. This path leads to a period of genuine strategic rupture in Gulf architecture, with significant regional instability and a likely acceleration of UAE-China commercial integration as Abu Dhabi seeks alternatives to American-dominated systems. The probability of this path increases significantly after any major escalation in the Iran-Israel-US triangle. Path 3, the technology threshold. This is the path that matters most in the long run, and it is the one receiving the least analytical attention. At some point, and the technical assessments suggest this point is closer than publicly acknowledged, the cumulative effect of technology flows through UAE and other transshipment networks will push Iranian military manufacturing capability past a threshold where sanctions pressure loses its strategic coercive value. Not because Iran becomes a conventional military superpower, but because the specific capabilities enabled by dual-use technology, precision drone manufacturing, advanced missile guidance, electronic warfare systems, reach a level of indigenous sufficiency that makes external component dependency marginal rather than critical. When that threshold is crossed, the entire strategic logic of the maximum pressure campaign collapses. You cannot coerce a military-industrial capability that no longer depends on what you are withholding. The Carnegie Endowment analysis published in late 2024 suggested that Iranian drone manufacturing had already achieved approximately 70% indigenous component sufficiency, up from an estimated 30% in 2019. The trajectory of that curve, if it continues, reaches meaningful sufficiency somewhere in the 2026 to 2028 window. That is not a distant hypothetical. That is the current strategic timeline. I think we are operating simultaneously across all three paths right now, with Path 1 providing the surface narrative, Path 2 representing the unstated threat that both Washington and Abu Dhabi are managing around, and Path 3 advancing quietly beneath both. The headlines will continue to emphasize Path 1 right up until either Path 2 or Path 3 produces a development dramatic enough to break through the managed narrative. At that point, the analysis you have heard tonight will have been on record long before the mainstream commentary catches up. Here are the questions I want you to carry with you. Who in Washington is actually tracking the cumulative technology transfer picture, and do they have the institutional authority to act on what they find? What specific triggering event would be sufficient to force a genuine US-UAE confrontation over compliance? And perhaps most importantly, if the UAE has concluded that a fully isolated Iran is more dangerous to Gulf stability than a partially integrated one, is that calculation wrong, or is it simply inconvenient for the framework Washington has spent 4 decades constructing? Tell me in the comments which path you think is most likely to dominate the next 12 months. Tell me whether you think Washington's internal assessment of UAE compliance matches the picture the data presents, or whether the gap between official posture and operational reality has become so normalized that it no longer registers as a problem worth solving. We will keep tracking every development in the Gulf, in the free zones of Jebel Ali, in the OFAC designation lists, and in the quiet diplomatic channels where the real architecture of this relationship is actually being negotiated. That is what this analysis exists to do every single time. Subscribe now. Share this with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in Gulf geopolitics beneath the level of official statements and diplomatic theater. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update. Because in this region, at this moment, the gap between what is being said publicly and what is actually happening operationally has never been wider, and that gap is exactly where the most consequential decisions are being made. End of script, approximate word count, 3,509th estimated duration, 1921 minutes at 170 WPM.